we good?
Recording in progress.
Right. Good morning and welcome to the Delta Stewardship Council meeting. It is 9:33 on Thursday, October 24th, 2024. We're here at the CNRA building at 715 P Street in Sacramento, California. And my name is Julie Lee and I am chair of the Delta Stewardship Council. Emma, can you explain to us how the public can participate in this meeting?
If any member of the public is interested in providing public comment on any agenda item during today's meeting, please send an email blue card to engage@deltacouncil.ca.gov as seen on the screen. Be sure to note your name and the agenda item you wish to speak on. When called, the clerk will unmute you.
Thank you. And can you lead us in the roll call vote?
Yes, I will lead us in roll call. Councilmember Burgess. Here. Councilmember Weso.
Here.
Councilmember Damrell.
Here.
Councilmember Maranian.
Here.
Vice Chair Miller. Here. Councilmember Zingali.
Here.
Chair Lee.
Here. Thank you. We have a quorum. Our next agenda item is public comment. This is for the public to comment on any topic that is not on the council's agenda. Any comments on the items on the agenda will be taken during that item. Emma, do we have any public comments for items not on today's agenda?
No, Madam Chair, we do not.
Right, thank you. Our next item is the consent calendar. We have one item, the adoption of the September 26, 2024 meeting summary. Members, is there any need for discussion on the consent item? No? Okay, before we vote then, I'll ask if there are any public comments on items on the consent calendar.
No, Madam Chair, there are not.
All right, I'll entertain a motion to approve these items. All right, we will proceed with a roll call vote.
Councilmember Burgess.
Yes.
Councilmember Damrell. Councilmember Weso.
Yes.
Councilmember Maranian.
Yes.
Vice Chair Miller. Aye. Councilmember Zingali.
Yes.
Chair Lee.
Yes.
The motion passes.
All right, thank you. Next agenda item is the chair's report. We have kicked off October with a lot of activity, a few items of note since our last meeting. I attended with some of our staff the California Native American Day, the Bay Delta Science Conference, and the Independent Science Board meeting, which was held in the Delta at the Ride Hotel. I think some other folks are going to give us some more details about those items later in the meeting. We've also met with Bureau of Reclamation and held 2 tribal EJ issue paper roundtable listening sessions. And looking ahead, we have our DPIC Autumn Gathering on Monday, October 28th, with the theme being levees. We'll be at Bogle Vineyard for that, and the public is invited to attend. And then on the 31st, I'll be attending the National Heritage Area Advisory Committee in Oakland. And I will see Councilmember Burgess there. And yesterday, kind of the highlight of the month for me so far was Brian Chapin arranged a boat tour of the Delta with 2 USGS folks, was attended by myself, Vice Chair Gail Miller, Assemblymember Pappin, and a couple of her staffers, Caitlin and David, and Pablo Garcia, the Chief Consultant for the Assembly Committee on Water, Parks, and Wildlife, as well as Jay Ziegler, the Delta Water Master. And then Campbell Ingram also joined us from the Delta Conservancy in the afternoon. And I think, the big takeaway of the trip for me was seeing the Lookout Slough project, which came to this council as a covered action and now has the breaches on the levee done. It was super interesting to see what a 3,000-acre restoration project looks like. John Bureau from the USGS, who was kind of our guide and mentor throughout the trip, gave us several presentations during the day with sort of a focus on tidal flows. And I think, what I kind of took away from a lot of his comments were, his real interest in making sure that there was continued good science collaboration in the Delta. He mentioned that several times during our trip, and his comments really brought home for me that, this council really needs to continue to make science collaboration a priority. It's been a recurrent theme for us, and we definitely, we don't want to hear that some folks feel like we're heading in the wrong direction on collaboration. So I think, we can all keep that at the forefront of what we're doing. John also had a lot of hopeful things to say about the larger scale restoration projects and how much food that would potentially provide for fish, and he had some great ideas on how to get that food in the right places using tidal flow strategies. So it was a really interesting day, and I'll see, Gail, did you have any thoughts about the day?
No, I just thank you again to Brandon. It was really fantastic. Oh, sorry. Thank you. Thank you again to Brandon. It was, I thought, just a spectacular day all around, and certainly just the learning is incredible. I think one of the pieces that they kept letting us know about is just how large the Delta is, and it was true. We spent 6 hours and we barely scratched the surface. And then just Lisa Marie, in terms of the science program, hearing from everyone this idea that we have of consistent open source science that we all agree on, especially when it comes to the tides, for example, and what we can do in making sure we incorporate the tides into the food system work you're doing. So it was really fantastic, and Brandon, really, you did an incredible job. So thank you very much for all of your skill and organizing.
Yeah.
I was very inspired.
Me too, yeah, and it was just an absolutely gorgeous day. I don't think I've been down there on a nicer day, and the water was like glass. It was just incredibly beautiful. Diane, did you have anything else you wanted to say about the National Heritage meeting that's coming up on the 31st?
It's going to be on October 31st in Oakley. This is kind of the standing up of the National Heritage Area Management Plan Advisory, and there's a lot of exciting things going on. I'm looking forward to getting more people involved in understanding the opportunities attached to this designation.
Yeah, that's great. Campbell mentioned it yesterday as well at our during our tour. People seem really excited about it, so that's great. All right, I think that's it for my updates, unless any members have anything else they want to add. Nope. Okay. Are there any public comments on this item?
No, Madam Chair, there are not.
All right. Our next agenda item is the Executive Officer's Report, and I'll turn it over to Jessica Pearson.
Good morning. Thank you. Well, we've had a very full and exciting October. The Delta Science Program hosted, as the chair mentioned, the first in-person Bay Delta Science Conference since 2018. And we had approximately 800 attendees from over 200 organizations. So it was really wonderful to see friends and colleagues and meet new people and do so in person and learn about all the great science that's happening throughout the region. Special thanks to council staff who put on such a successful event, in particular the lead planners Maggie Chrisman and Miranda Tilcock from the science program. Amanda Bowl and Chair Lee and I also met this month with Carl Stock, the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation's Regional Director for California and the Great Basin. And we provided Carl with an overview of the council's work, of our activities under DPIC, and the ways that the council and Reclamation are collaborating, including on the Delta Crosscut Budget Report, which is coming out soon, the Delta Science Tracker, and also the peer reviews that we help conduct for their agency. Yesterday, it's been kind of a year of ribbon cutting. The Smith Canal Gate project had a ribbon cutting ceremony. That was yesterday, attended by Deputy Executive Officer for Planning Jeff Henderson and our lead engineer Aaron Mullen. This project was a covered action that was reviewed upon appeal reviewed by the council in 2019. And it is a $96 million local and state-led project, which is designed to provide a 200-year level of flood protection for 8,500 properties in the economically vulnerable areas of Stockton. So big deal project. Had a lot of hurdles to go through, and so glad to see that on the ground and beginning to operate. Under covered action certifications, the Department of Water Resources has filed a certification of consistency for the to 2026 proposed geotechnical activities to include soil borings, cone penetration tests, and water quality tests. The information obtained from these activities are intended to inform the continued planning and design of the Delta Conveyance Project. This covered action certification is available for public review on the council's website. And we have a short video clip, I believe, to help people easily navigate our website. So we're going to cue that up. Thank you. To view the certification, select Delta Plan tab from the top menu, and then click on Covered Actions. The certification is going to be the first item in the resulting list. The 30-day statutory window for appeals of this certification closes 5 p.m. on November 7th. Any questions, please contact us at hello@deltacouncil.ca.gov. There were no comment letters this month. We do have an outreach highlights report and active projects list that is in your packet and online. In terms of our social media and outreach, the Bay Delta Science Conference earned top attention on our X, Instagram, and LinkedIn platforms, as well as through our email listserv. Additionally, more than a dozen council web pages have recently been updated with new information, so be sure to check out our new co-authored blog about our tribal and environmental justice issue paper. That's also still open for public comment and review and available on our website. And we have a monitoring strategy for cyanobacterial harmful algal blooms, or CHABs, in the Delta, which was just posted on the council's website and distributed this week. And staff are going to present to you next month on the strategy, including its purpose and implementation steps. So look for that in November. We do not have a legal update or legislative update today, but I am going to invite Morgan Chow to the table, Environmental Program Manager for our new Climate Change and Environmental Justice Unit. And Morgan's going to give us a brief update on some of the outreach that we've been doing on our Delta Adapts program. Welcome, Morgan.
Thanks, JP, and good morning, Chair Lee and council members. As JP said, I'm Morgan Chow. I'm our program manager for our Climate Change and Environmental Justice Unit, and I just get to show you some fun pictures this morning. So as you heard at our September Tribal and Environmental Justice presentation, as well as probably previous briefings, a core component of our ongoing outreach related to our long-term planning efforts is reaching people that have been historically left out of government planning efforts and prioritizing and legitimizing the perspectives of disproportionately burdened communities. So we've approached this in several ways. The one we're highlighting today is really our attendance at community events and meetings, where this is following a best practice to just meet people where they are. So throughout the year, we've attended more than 20 meetings and events, reaching hundreds of people. And in September, we attended 6 events, including some of which that you see here, but we were at Bethel Island, Antioch, Stockton, Sacramento, and West Sacramento, and we're planning on attending several more this fall in Isleton, Walnut Grove, and others. So I'm just sharing a few photos. We've been to many different events, from neighborhood events, city and county events, community organization coalition meetings, cleanups, holiday events, and it's really been a great way to hear from community members, share who the council is, and also connect with service providers like El Concilio that was on the first slide in Stockton. And then these photos here are from Native American Day that was mentioned, a municipal advisory committee meeting, a neighborhood event, and Antioch's Big Truck Day. And then lastly, I just wanted to share that all of these events have really pushed staff to be, next slide, yeah, fun and engaging, creative, and creating new educational materials to get people to come talk to us. So here you can see we have our first ever Delta Stewardship Council coloring pages. We have a few that are out now, which have been a hot ticket for kids and adults. We also have some resources like emergency information by county that people can take, and we also created word searches and crossword puzzles. We also have trivia questions that are ongoing, we're adding to continually, and some just Delta educational posters. So Big thanks to Dane Wicker, Megan Wynn, and Annika Ragsdale for developing these materials, and just our growing outreach team across council staff that have been attending all of these events. So that's all from me. Thanks for listening.
That's terrific, Morgan. I really like the creative materials too. Y'all didn't create that ofrenda, did you? That was at the event you went to?
No,
Yeah.
that was, I was just
Got
going
it.
to share
I was
that.
gonna say, that would really
Yeah.
be like an award-winning creation
We
if
did
we're getting our materials out like that. Thank you.
Yeah.
Right. JP, was there anything else on your report?
Yeah, I'm going to summarize what's left on the agenda. Thank you so much for that, Morgan. I'm really excited to show my son this crossword puzzle because he's 6 and he's really obsessed with making crossword puzzles right now. So he'll be excited that there's one from mommy's work that he can do. So next, we're going to hear from members of the Delta Flood Management Community to present a high-level overview of their roles and responsibilities, along with a discussion of challenges and opportunities facing the Delta levee system now and in the future. At the end of the panel, Amanda is also going to brief you on Monday's DPIC meeting, which we've touched upon a little bit here today, but she's going to give a little more detail about how that meeting is also going to focus on a deeper dive on levees, which we've been referring to as really the backbone of the co-equal goals. And finally, Delta lead scientist Dr. Wyndham Myers is going to feature a recent publication written by Dr. Don Hankins, who will be joining us remotely to highlight the critical roles of Indigenous knowledge in the stewardship of natural resources, particularly regarding our preparations for and adaptations to climate change. So that concludes my report. I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Members have any questions? Yes, Member Dengali.
Thanks, Jessica. I was just curious, when you mentioned the posts or pages where we get the most traffic online, can you just elaborate a little bit on what that means in terms of, is it metrics of how many people come, how long they stay, and what are some of those numbers like? I'm just curious about that.
Maybe I could invite up Abbott from our comm shop. You're talking about what Morgan had? I think just generally our
Actually,
website
Jessica
engagement.
mentioned, yeah, that there were certain points of our website engagement that were at the top. I think you might have said the outreach highlights report. Sounds right.
Yeah, I think what I referred to was the listserv and social media engagement, which we definitely do have some metrics for. But I'm sure we're able to also see which web pages attract the most attention on
Yeah,
our
just generally,
website.
how are
Yeah.
we being received? Where's it working? Where's it not working?
Yeah, if you look in the outreach highlights report, it should be in your binder. We will put in the top post for each platform, so we know what the top Twitter X post was, Instagram. And interestingly, this time around, each platform had a different top post, which usually it's the same thing, but this one had a different one. I don't have it in front of me, so I can't recall exactly what it was.
But it's in the binder. We can look in the
Yeah.
binder.
Does Carly have it? All right. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. So you could see Twitter, we had 35 tweets. We had 2 new followers. Twitter and X has been kind of, going through something. Instagram, we got 25 new followers, which is really good. LinkedIn, 12 new followers. Facebook, 2 new followers. And you could see that each of the content is different on each one. And then for the email announcements, we sent out 10 last month with, we got 6 new subscribers. We're at 2,900 subscribers now, going for 3,000, so.
Great. Yeah, I agree. The new subscribers and
Yes.
followers, those are really good indicators.
Yeah, absolutely. And then you could see the top web pages were about the council member webpage, and also what is environmental justice. So those were some of those. But it's, every month we gather this information and put it in this report, and we put it online. Okay.
We also had an award at our science conference that recognizes a top contributing scientist, and that particular post for Matt Nobriga, who received the award, got a lot of engagement. Do you happen to know off the top of your head about our website and our web pages where we get the most traffic, or is that something we need to just follow up on?
Well, the About the Council webpage is the most
Your
popular one.
bios and your
The
photos?
bios and your photos.
Somebody else.
Yeah. And then what is environmental justice? That was really big. Obviously, we just released the Tribal and Environmental Justice paper, so that got a lot of attention this past month as well. And we even dive deeper and go viewership by device. A lot of people, 91% actually look at our website on a desktop, 8% on their cell phones. Yeah. Okay,
Great. Thank you for that
you're welcome.
impromptu
Yes.
presentation.
Thank you, Morgan.
All right.
Anything else?
Any other questions for JP from the members? If not, I'll ask if there's any public comments.
No, Madam Chair, there is no public comment.
All righty. I think we're ready to move on to agenda item 7, which is Delta levies, challenges and opportunities. So I'll invite up Erin Mullen, and she's going to bring her team and introduce them. I'll just read our little summary while she gets set up. Delta levees are a critical part of keeping people safe and maintaining a reliable water supply for over 27 million people. The council has an important role in educating the community and partner agencies about the challenges and opportunities associated with flood risk in the Delta. At this month's meeting, members of the flood management community will provide an overview of issues related to Delta levees. The presentation will also include a brief preview of the upcoming Delta Plan Interagency Implementation Committee meeting on October 28th, which is at Bogle Vineyards. We're luring people in with the vineyard. All right, and I just want to thank you all for being here. And Erin, do you want to go ahead and introduce your team?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. For the record, my name is Erin Mullen. I am the lead engineer for the Stewardship Council, and I am delighted to be here today. Anybody that's worked with me for any length of time knows that I am very passionate about levees and flood management, and so I think this is a really important topic for the council. I would like to add a little bit to what Julie said. I think I have this new catchphrase that I'm going to shop it here, and I'm trying to hope it catches on. As you know, the council was created to promote and achieve the co-equal goals. Well, I like to say that the co-equal goals are built on a foundation of levees. Without levees, we do not have a reliable water supply, and our ecosystem would be changed in a way that I don't think that any of us can even imagine. Frank's Tract is a really good example of what the Delta would look like at a large scale. And right now, I think the estimates for what it would look like to restore Frank's Tract, I think, are $3 billion. So catastrophic levee failures across the Delta are something that I don't think any of us would like to imagine. We often hear that the Delta that the levees are a system, and that is both politically, hydraulically, and administratively. So that is why we are here today with a variety of people that participate in that system. So I think it's important that, we all have a good understanding of what it takes to keep the system going. So I'm delighted to introduce Tom Zuckerman, who, well, for most people, he needs no introduction. He's a lifelong Delta resident and has worn many hats, including serving as counsel for the Central Delta Water Agency. We have Joe Countryman, who has over 40 years of levee engineering under his belt and currently serves on the Central Valley Flood Protection Board and has since 2012. And Wendy Wang, who works for the Central Valley Flood Protection, who is currently working on the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan, and before that worked for the Central Valley Flood Protection Board, and we are delighted to have her as well. So with that, I will hand it over to Joe, who is going to talk about the role of the Flood Board in the Delta. Thank you, Joe.
Oh, yeah. Well, it's good to be here. As she mentioned, I worked for the Corps of Engineers for 23 years, and then I had a private engineering firm for another 20 plus years, and then got appointed to the Flood Board. So yes, I have quite a bit of experience with the flood system. Now, the Central Valley Flood Protection Board used to be called the Reclamation Board, but our primary duty is to be the state representative for federal projects. When the state wants to cost share or participate in a project, the Central Valley Flood Protection Board is where they go. And what we do is with the Corps requires lands, easements, rights of way, and relocations, and operation and maintenance assurances. And that's what our flood board gives. And along with that, we inspect those project levies, find deficiencies, encroachments. I mean, we found things like, farmers that have tried to get a little bit of extra land and went about 10 feet into the levee to get it. And things like, like that. And when any project's going on where these project levies are, they have to get a permit from us to make sure that the work being done is consistent with the design and operation of the levee system. So there's about 1,600 miles of levee that we're responsible for. That includes the Sacramento all the way up to Chico and the San Joaquin River down to about Merced. So it's a big job, a lot of responsibility. Now, out of that 1,600 miles, there's 380 of those project levee miles in the Delta. And there's another 720 miles of non-federal levies. Those are ones that the Corps did not participate in, did not design, and we haven't given assurances for. The non-federal levies were built by the local interests and operated and maintained as such. One of the interesting things about that is, I don't know if you are aware of the PL 8499 program, but that's a federal program during a flood emergency where the federal government will come in and help. It has two aspects, flood fighting and rehabilitation of the levees. The non-federal levees aren't eligible for the rehabilitation part. So as you've probably been told or noticed that in the past, when there's been a levee failure, it's the state of California for those non-project levies that steps in and has to pay the money to recover the island. Whereas the project levies are eligible for PL 8499 rehabilitation. And we get significant help from the federal government in recovering those islands. I mentioned that we issue permits for work on the levees, on the project levees, and there's over 100 permits a year that we process in order to do that. One of the big responsibilities and most effective responsibilities we have is the Delta Levee Maintenance Subventions Program. I'm sure you've heard about that because I've talked to your staff many times about it. But it's probably the most cost-effective program the state of California has ever put forward. They offer a carrot to the local landowners to tax themselves and improve and maintain the levee system. And since, let's see, what does it say here? 2006, I think it went before that, but 1973 is when it started, but we got bond money in 2006, and we spent $200 million in fixing and improving the levee system in the Delta. And I'm sure without that influx of money, the Delta would look nothing like it does now. There would be a lot more looking like Frank's Track out there. So it's been a great program, and the board is happy to participate in it. So I'll finish my comments there.
Thanks, Joe. Now I'm going to hand it over to Wendy Wang, who's going to talk about the state plan of flood control, the Central Valley, and the state's plan for our project levies.
Thanks, Erin. So today I'm here to discuss the project levies that reside within the Delta. And bear with me, I'm going to say a lot of things that you all probably already know. But for the folks online that maybe aren't quite so familiar with levies in the Delta, all these levies, they are also known as state plan of flood control levies. So I might refer to them by either name today. They were built a long time ago by local farming interests using whatever materials were on hand. A lot of primitive methods too, like dredging. Despite that, though, they play a really important role in protecting all of us, not just those in the Delta, from flood risk. And they do become more vulnerable in the face of climate change, shifting priorities, as well as funding gaps. That's why it's so critical to have the Delta top of mind while we're doing planning. So, starting with some numbers for context, I think a lot of us are technical folks. Kind of what Joe talked about, right? If we look at the larger scale system-wide state plan of flood control, there's 1,600 miles of levees. About a quarter of those reside in the Delta. But if we zoom in to look at just the Delta boundaries, there's about 1,100 miles total in the Delta, and about a third of those are the project levees. And so that's the little pieces I'm focusing on. And while the Delta levees, the project levees there, they only make up about a quarter of the total SPFC levees in the larger Central Valley, they're still absolutely critical to the success of the system and are actually quite special in the way they function. So these special Delta levees, they're asked to do a lot more than the river levees are asked to do in the rest of the system. Unlike most river levees, they're expected to hold back water 24/7. And so despite what I mentioned earlier, not being constructed to strict engineering standards, right? A lot of it's just farmers pushing dirt up together. They're expected to withstand the constant pressure of water up against them from different things like tides, wind, boat wakes. There's a lot going on, yet they're still expected to function 100% of the time. And that's what makes them so unique. The Delta SPFC levees also face a lot of unique challenges and considerations that continue evolving over time, and some that are exacerbated with climate change. So making it harder for them to do their job, making it harder for us to plan around, right? Things like major floods, earthquakes, rising sea levels. There's changing economic activity and trends, changing levels of farming interest. There's also constantly changing the state and federal legislation, and that might affect things like how maintenance is allowed to be or should be done on the levees themselves. Of course, always top of mind, public health and safety, right? And then last but not least, there's always evolving values in California and the different citizens of not only the people in the Delta, but larger California as a whole, right? So besides farming interest in the Delta, there's also growing interest in multiple benefits. So we got ecosystem uplift, recreation, recognition of the Delta as a place. For example, the Sacramento San Joaquin Delta was established as the first national heritage area in California back in 2019, which is very exciting. And so I've talked a little bit about what we need these levees to do, right? A lot of constant work. They don't get any overtime. They don't get a break. But they're asked to protect all these things: urban areas, small communities, major conveyance corridors, critical infrastructure, and more. But how do we make sure that these SPFC levees in the Delta, all these project levees, how do we make sure they can continue doing their jobs with the ever-changing conditions and new challenges that come up every day? That's where a lot of this planning comes in. The long-term planning is so important. And the project levees in the Delta are so critical. They're one of the most critical components, right, to the planning efforts in the larger Central Valley. And what I'm here representing, the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan. So every 5 years at the Department of Water Resources, we develop a CVFPP. It provides a strategic blueprint for reducing flood risk in the Central Valley, but also protecting ecosystems and supporting watershed management. And we developed the CVFPP collaboratively. So it really represents an extensive coordination and engagement among local, state, and federal groups and agencies, including the DSC. I worked with Erin very closely throughout the last cycle update. It lays out strategies for how we can prioritize the state's investment in flood management over a 30-year planning horizon, promoting multiple benefits, and then integrating and improving ecosystem functions associated with flood risk reduction projects. Overall, we have a really strong interest in the Delta with the CVFPP and all planning efforts because we recognize how important the Delta is to the larger SPFC system as a whole. Almost all of the water generated within the CVFPP system-wide planning area, so everything Joe and the Central Valley Flood Protection Board is authorized to oversee, all of that water ultimately flows downstream through the delta, and we really can't be successful in our planning without a healthy delta. And I'll hand it back over to Erin. Thank you.
Thank you, Wendy. I'm now going to hand it over to Tom, who's going to speak from the perspective of a local landowner and reclamation district. Thank you.
Thank you, Erin. When Erin asked me to do this, it set me back to thinking, and I've been involved in this for a long time. And going back through my papers, I discovered that I wrote a paper called The Fight Against the River, the story of the reclamation of the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta in 1964, when I was a graduate student in college at that time. And I brought a copy of it. I reviewed it this morning, and I realized I was a lot smarter then than I am now. I'm glad to have the opportunity to talk to you. There are a lot of new faces here. I used to come to your meetings regularly, and then in the pandemic, I became addicted to remote stuff, and I haven't seen most of you, although we did have a session with the Independent Science Board down at Ringe Track a couple of weeks ago, and that was good session. I think it's important for you to understand some of the history of where the levees in the Delta came from. The federal government passed the Swamp Act, the Arkansas Act, in 1850, which is about the same time that California became a state. And the consequence of that was the federal government turned over swamp and overflow federal lands to the state for disposition under certain restrictions, very much like the Homestead Acts that came along later. There were acreage limitations. The money that was paid for the land, which was $1 an acre, had to be reinvested to show that reclamation efforts were actually taking place. And the reason for the reclamation had to be restricted to agriculture and commercial activities. I mention this because, as you'll see later on, levees that were built not in 1850, well, I'll get into that, but for flood control to protect the farmland behind them became multitask levees that do a lot of different things that are not directly related to the farming of the lands themselves. And I think it's important that we all understand that when we start talking about some of the programs and financial problems that are associated with it. But although these lands were made available and most of them were claimed, like a mining claim, it wasn't really feasible, and particularly in the lower parts of the Delta, to build levees at that time. So very little of the Delta was actually reclaimed successfully. One estimate I saw in my paper was 8,000 acres only of the over 500,000 acres that are farmed today had been reclaimed by about 1880. And what made it possible to build decent levees in the Delta was the advent of the clamshell dredger, which showed up in the Delta about 1892. And from that point on, it was possible to reach out with these dredger arms, get the competent soils from the channel bottoms that had washed into the Delta during the hydraulic mining periods, and build competent levees. Prior to that time, they were trying to build levees using wheelbarrows full of peat soil and so forth, that whenever the water raised, the lands would be flooded. So there was very little successful reclamation until the turn of the century. And actually, between about 1900 and 1920, really, almost all of the levees that you see in the Delta today were established at that time. And as I say, they were established strictly for farming, basically, and to protect some of the cities that surround the Delta or beginning to get developed. In order to, when the original swamp and overflow land grants and patents were issued, there were acreage limitations. You could only qualify for 320 acres at any one ownership, and it really became infeasible to try to build a whole levee system around every 320 acres. So over time, there was a lot of consolidation of the ownership in the Delta, and three major levee building companies with their own clamshell dredgers and so forth became to dominate the reclamation of most of the islands in the Delta. What I'll do is I will send Aaron a copy of this paper rather than getting into all of the detail, but I think you would find it rather interesting. There's a lot of anecdotes and things about that are interesting. So as those levees were built, they would just take mud from the bottom of the river and slap it up on the natural levees, or if they were trying to be more efficient, they would make straight lines rather than follow the actual natural levees in the Delta. And that's important to understand because there are different geological circumstances underlying different sections of the levee. Some of them were built on established natural levees, some of them were built over channels, some of them were built over peat soil. And over the years, with the problems of dealing with reclamation and maintenance of these levees, the engineers have had to develop different techniques to deal with each of those situations. These levees, of course, at first were just mud levees, and as recreational transportation and water transfer and everything began to go through the Delta, there was a lot of erosion going on. So over time, the levee building has added rock revetment around the periphery of these levees, which has had a good impact upon maintaining the levees, but also allowing for vegetation to grow, which otherwise was being replaced all the time as the dredger would come around and put a new supply of mud on the levee to take care of the erosion that was taking place. So we have a levee system now that is basically privately financed. After 1973, with Senator Way's Way Bill program, we began to get some state assistance through the maintenance program, and that grew as we began to get some very significant floods in the Delta in the late 70s and the early 80s. And the facts are that since about, well, I think for the last 25, maybe almost 30 years, as a result of the efforts that we've been able to undertake in the Delta with these programs, we haven't had a major flood in the Delta. If you look back historically, and it's in this paper, all of these islands flooded at least 3 times, some of them 8 or 10 times prior to that time. So as I think Joe said, this is probably the most successful infrastructure program that the state of California has undertaken. It's been relatively cheap. It's had the cooperation and the driving energy behind it from the landowners and the farmers in the area, which has kept the costs down and kept everything pretty reasonable. And it's a very, very good program. So that there are a number of challenges that we face in maintaining these levees as basically private owners with some assistance from the state. Incidentally, I will say that even though the subventions program makes 75% of the eligible costs available from the state, that rarely has been the case. And I think if you look back over time, you would find that probably close to 50% of the actual costs of doing the levee maintenance has been borne by the local landowners due to a lack of money and other imperatives that the state brings along with them when they administer these programs. So the challenges that we face, of course, are salinity intrusion. You know, we need to have enough water flowing through the Delta to keep the salt water out, to keep the farmers in business, to keep supporting the levees. That's a number one thing. We've had a great deal of subsidence over the years as the organic soils have been exposed to the hot summers in row crop farming and so forth. There's been a lot of oxidation of the organic soils in the Delta to the point where maybe only 200,000 of the 500,000 acres that are farmed in the Delta are now considered to be organic soils. And that subsidence in some cases has gone as much as 20 to 25 feet below the river level. So the levees have had to be a lot stronger in order to withstand the pressures that are generated by the subsidence on the end, not to mention the threat of sea level rise and global warming that's going on now. So it's a fairly expensive process to maintain these levees, and the economy of the Delta has not been great. We've had a lot of problems with markets, with more commonly grown crops, and part of that has been labor costs driving expenses up, and the other is foreign imports of things like wine and asparagus and one thing or another that has pretty much wiped out some of the opportunities in the Delta. I could go on for hours, and I won't, but I just want to thank you again for taking the time to educate yourselves on this thing. The levees are what the Delta is. There's no going back. I mean, we can't, if we start to lose one levee, we're going to lose the one next to it and then the one next to that because of the pressures that generate from wind fetch and so forth. It is a system. We need to maintain it all at a reasonable level. Some of the levees protect more important things than others, and oftentimes there's another financial pool to help maintain those levees to a higher standard. But it's very important that we have a reasonable standard not only to deal with what we're dealing with today, but what we're going to be dealing with as sea level rise increases. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. I would like to make a couple closing statements before we open it up to questions. The name of this agenda item is Delta Levees, Challenges and Opportunities, and I imagine that as council members, you might be wondering what that means for you. We have heard from 3 members of the Delta community and Delta levee managers about the challenges and opportunities that they are experiencing in the Delta. The Delta is such a complicated place, and the word Delta means change and transition. And, you know, we didn't even begin to touch on the complexity of the system. It is possible to have project levies and non-project levies on the same island. So you may have a federal levy that just all of a sudden abruptly stops being a federal levy and now is a local levy on the same island. That just sort of touches on the challenges. And one of the unique things about the Delta is that just the way that it has evolved over time, the different interests and authorities have sort of operated in silos. And, you know, so all of the experts in the field have kind of made their decisions and operated independent of one another. And I think that has created the challenge. And the opportunity for this council is to start to convene these independent silos and bring them together and start to, you know, kind of set the table and create the collaborative atmosphere to start to look at these challenges and, you know, really start to daylight them. And that, I think, is the opportunity that this council has and that this agency really has the potential to move forward with. And I would like to thank the council for allowing me to present today on that topic. So thank you, and I open it up to questions.
Could I add one thing to that?
Oh, sure.
Since about 2000, I think, the Secretary of Resources established a committee called the Delta Levees and Habitat Advisory Committee. I'm one of the charter members of that committee, and it's been very helpful because many of the conflicts that might otherwise exist between the Department of Fish and Wildlife or the Department of Water Resources or the local reclamation districts are aired there on a monthly basis. We meet the first Friday of every month all of the major players are involved in that, and it's been very helpful. So it's not a wilderness out there. We are working together, and we appreciate any support that the Stewardship Council can find within its means to help us.
Well, I'll open it up for council members to ask any questions of our panelists. Yes, Councilmember Burgess.
So as my term on the Stewardship Council starts to approach, I'm thinking about the fact that early on, we were talking about the Delta levy investments. And there was so much concern about the subventions program not being funded. And one thing that I'm really interested in is actually making that more official. It just seems like it's kind of like, well, DWR will put some money there, but there's nothing to depend on. And, I've walked on levees with farmers that had reclamation districts but couldn't maintain all the requirements that if someday they might be able to get some help, it just wasn't worth it because they couldn't do it. And then I'm thinking about those same farmers that now have, projects next to them where the slough or the water body near it is going to be impacted because of drainage and people that are moving into these areas and impervious surfaces, creating more water. There's just all of these changes as you're talking about. And I think I really appreciate the chair and the staff bringing this topic up because it is so important. It is really one of the basis of what we need to be thinking about as far as the Delta. And I think about, you talked about the technology that gave us the ability to create these levees that were more stable and dependable. And I keep thinking, what other technology has been developed that we could do better, So one of the questions that I was hoping would maybe kind of be addressed is, there's a lot of discussions about seismic issues on levees. So do any of you want to kind of talk about where you're at on that topic?
I'd love the opportunity, and a little background on this. The DREAM study that the Corps of Engineers conducted a few years ago, one of Joe's cohorts, Gil Cosio, and I were involved as stakeholders in that thing. And at some point, the Corps had decided that all the levees were going to collapse if we had a 6-point-something earthquake in the Delta. I mean, it was just this huge calamity. And we didn't think that that was necessarily the case. I was in Kobe in Japan. My wife is Japanese. I lived there a couple of months out of the year. And I went to the earthquake museum there where they actually had an 8 magnitude Richter earthquake in Osaka Bay. And they have the museum there in Kobe. And what was interesting was that all of the Shinkansen, the bullet train fell down, buildings fell down, 7,000 people were killed in a few minutes. The levees around there seemed to, with very few exceptions, survive. And the consultants that had looked at it afterwards, including some of the people from California, incidentally, from the universities here, it decided that because they had rock revetment on one side of the levee and counterbalancing berms on the other side of the levee, that the levee was well protected from foundation problems, and they survived. Well, I came back and realized that's exactly the way we're building our levees here, exactly. Subsequent to that, the Green Valley earthquake, they had installed a bunch of deep seismic sensors, an array of them in the Delta, and they were able to record the ground attenuation of the major earthquake up in that area, and the Corps demonstrated that they were a magnitude off in their calculations, that the levees were at least twice as safe as they had calculated in an earthquake situation. So most of the problems that we might have with the delta levees would be the ones that are the closest to the major faults, and it's because the delta narrows as it goes to the west. That's basically Sherman Island, Twitchell Island. That's where almost all of the threat is today. And interestingly enough, who owns Sherman Island now? The Department of Water Resources. Who owns Twitchell Island? Well, most of it's owned by the Department of Water Resources. So if we're going to have a major seismic problem in the Delta, it's kind of in the hands of the Department of Water Resources at this point. But most people that have studied the issue now don't feel that the danger in the eastern parts of the Delta is anywhere near what was predicted by the Corps of Engineers back 20 years ago.
Thank you. Again, I really appreciate this discussion happening.
Sure. Yes, Member Moradian.
Thank you for the presentation, and it's great that you characterized it as an infrastructure project and large-scale infrastructure project. And that made me think that when we think of that in that terms, the idea of preventive maintenance and the idea that it's uneven structures, because when we talk about infrastructure project, we think of one big thing that was built at the same time, cohesively, same material, same land, geotech, all of that. So, but this is not. So the challenge is it's uneven. Some of it is natural, some is built. Any kind of preventive maintenance and how we prioritize or not becomes not only technical, but also political, and a lot of other issues come into it. But I'm remembering that we had the presentation way back when we talked about how we bought a LiDAR to figure out, you know, which one comes first and how we prioritize. Can you shed some light on the total, kind of like the proportion of natural versus built, of old versus new, how much of it, what percentage is privatized, or private, what percent is not, federal, state? I mean, if a big picture of defining it as its pieces, but and then as a whole, how would you characterize that? And then please, also if you could shed some light on when you said that some is being done by private funds. Is that one pool of private fund or? Okay.
Landowners.
Okay.
Yeah. Originally, all the levees were built by the surrounding landowners, you know, in an attempt to get some land that they could grow wheat on to feed the people coming out of the gold rush and so forth. I mean, that's when all the population in Northern California, California as a whole, blossomed and the need for agricultural land. The federal levee program came along later when the deep water channels were built to Sacramento and Stockton, when the Central Valley Project started moving water across the delta through some of the major channels. And that's basically when the federal government got involved with these programs. But all of them were originally, you might say, private. Now, I put that in quotes because each of these islands has at least one public agency that takes care of the levees. They're called reclamation districts or levee maintenance districts. And they are established under state law. They usually are just consist of the land behind the levee, that's all. And I don't know how many active reclamation districts there are now, but one of the ones that I own land on is number 2041. Now, I don't know whether every number was taken up along the time, but there's a lot of reclamation districts. They extend not just in the Delta, but up and down the Central Valley as well, into the whole San Joaquin River system and most of the Sacramento River system below Red Bluff. So those districts tax themselves, and they levy assessments within their districts to pay for their share of the levy costs. And it's a real limitation as to how much work can be done, because oftentimes, the district can't raise enough money even to meet their share of the cost. That's a problem. So, I mean, what I do today is I'm working on creating new economies in the Delta that'll allow agriculture to sustain itself, be more successful, and be able to finance a larger share. I must say that, you know, and I'm sure you're all aware of this, there's a proposition on the ballot in 13 days or whenever it is now, Proposition 4, which will put some more money into the levy program. Without that, it's gone. All the money that has been set up by the state for Delta levy maintenance and special projects will be exhausted next year
So
in the absence of that.
You would
bond
say that the
funds.
majority is privately owned and maintained privately? Is that is that a good statement?
Yes, and
Okay.
each island is its own pool. It's
Sure,
not
sure.
a common pool.
Got it. Okay, and then, because I'm going back to the idea of this is an infrastructure project, in terms of the prioritization, I mean, is there a cohesive way of prioritizing, is one question, and then second question is, when you said, you were very complimentary of how it was built and flood protection, would we be able to say, like, for 100-year storm, this is good, or, I mean, how would you characterize that?
Well, we've had at least 2, probably 3 100-year storms in the last 25 years. I mean, I don't know how they calculate what a 100-year
That is
storm
100.
is.
It used to be 100.
Yeah, it used to be 100 years. And-
50 years.
And with very few exceptions, I mean, no exceptions, we haven't had a major island failure in the Delta in that period. So obviously, we're doing something right, because prior to that time, every time we got a major storm, there would be several islands that would, I mean, I can remember in my lifetime watching islands flood that we were farming on.
Sure.
So,
Prioritizing is another issue, how we prioritize. Is there a cohesive way of,
yeah, well,
for maintenance?
I think Aaron has come around to, maybe to our view on this, I'm not sure. But my thought is that we need to have a agricultural standard for all of the levees in the Delta, and not prioritize that. What we need to do is then identify within the islands that protect something of greater significance, whether it's a particular environmental situation, whether it's a state highway, whether it's a ship channel, or a aqueduct that transfers water to Contra Costa County or
But
something.
doesn't the Delta levy investment kind of do that at the higher level? But we haven't kind of gone all the way to the smaller.
We don't prioritize maintenance in
Okay.
DLIS.
Imagine like
Okay.
how Caltrans, is that what you're saying, does all the freeways? If an organization would do, okay, got
But
it.
it's
Thank
more
you.
than just maintenance, because
Yeah.
the situation is changing constantly.
Mm-hmm.
These levees are not, you know, you build one that doesn't just stay there.
Mm-hmm.
It can consolidate, it can erode and so forth. So we're constantly rebuilding them, and we call it maintenance maybe, but we're trying to maintain it to a level that will withstand global warming and sea level rise and so forth. So it's not just a maintenance program. We need to have a program to get and keep all of the islands at a minimum level, which is not foolproof, but will reduce the number of catastrophic failures down to something that we can manage. And then if there are special features, special,
Maintain them.
then we need to prioritize those
very
islands
good.
for
Yeah.
extra financing
Good
and extra
explanation.
work.
Thank you. And one last question, they talked about the, sure.
The subvention program actually does have different levels of priority in it currently. And, you know, I don't know how long that's going to last, if it can, you know, because the Achilles heel in the Delta is that there will be a levee failure there. There will be. There's no doubt in my mind about that. If you just consider all the probabilities, the state of the construction, there will be. And there's no way the local landowners can recover that island. The only way it can happen is if they have federal and state help. And so far, the governor has always stepped up when there's a failure and found a way to provide the funding to close the levee break and to pump the water out of the island. It would be much better if we had some, I don't know, you can never get a total assurance with the government, but at least you have a plan that says, okay, we recognize that this is a threat and it will probably happen. This is how we're going to address it, I think would be worth having.
Thank you. And then my last question is, you drew a comparison of our levies and Japan, and you talked about, that you think it's but then at the same time, we are not sure about that because of what just was discussed, right? That they're not all at the same quality, same land, same, height, elevation, all that. How would why would you said that you felt that? From an infrastructure standpoint, I mean, you drew a comparison, and I would be very happy if it is, but but in the light of everything else that we talked about, is that still a valid statement?
Well, I think it is. Most of the levees, they have a very extensive levee system in Japan, mostly riverine levees. But every river is well levied, down to the ocean. And when you get down to the ocean, you get into the tidal zone like we have in the Delta proper. And I think it's proof that the techniques that our engineers are using here are the right ones in order to minimize, and I agree with Joe, there's no guarantee we're not going to have a levee failure today, because one of the islands in the Delta is under threat right now, Victoria Island. It has a major boil and leak that's being addressed by Dutra as we speak. Highway 4 crosses Victoria Island. There's a distillery out there and a major farming operation. So it's something we have to be constantly vigilant about. But having some kind of an ongoing economic program, so we don't have to go back to the voters every 4 years or something with another bond issue, would be extremely helpful.
Thank you very
I want
much.
to just say one other thing. It's not just how high the levee is or what the cross-section of the levee is. When I was in private practice, one of our districts, I got a call in August that water was coming out the back of the levee, and Gil Cozio and I went up to check it out, and water was running. Every time the tide came up, water ran out the back of the levee. When we dug it out, it was a beaver den.
Oh, wow.
Completely invisible from above.
And now we have nutria that we're also,
Yeah, and we got super beavers there. Let's hope that we got that under control. But things like that can happen. And I think the last failure that we had in the Delta was from some sort of an animal thing.
Are you
It
referring to
doesn't
Jones Tract?
necessarily happen when you have a high flood flow.
Joe, are you referring to Jones Tract?
Yes.
Yeah, so just for the council people's members' understanding, the last major levee failure that we had in the Delta was Jones Tract, which was a sunny day failure. So it happened in the middle of summer, and it was not during a rainfall event or high water event. And the speculation is that it was an animal den that led to the failure.
Thank you.
Delta levees don't overtop usually. What happens is the section is
Underneath.
insufficient to withstand the pressures. And you
Sure.
get these beaver dens and things that they're very difficult to detect. And you get a tide or something, which is probably what's happening on Victoria Island as we speak. And all of a sudden you get what's called a boil, where the water starts coming through the levee. And it's okay if it's clear, But if it's muddy, it's moving material. And that's what's happening on Victoria Island today. And that's the one that you really get concerned about.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Yes, Member Hueso.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. I've always looked at Frank's Track, wondering why they call it Frank's Track, because it looks more like an open body of water or a lake. But was Frank's Track ever a track? Is that where a levee failed and was never recovered?
Yes, that was an island like the rest of the islands, and there was a failure there, and it wasn't economical. It couldn't be closed in time and economically put back. So what was land is now a ocean or a water desert there because it's too deep for plants, and it just sits there. But yes, it was an island like the rest of them.
And the assessment was probably made in terms of its agricultural value or economic value?
You know, I wasn't there at that time to how it was, but the Corps wasn't going to come in, and the state apparently didn't have the wherewithal to move on it, and it just, you know, that's
It's like
what it is
90
now.
year ago.
Oh, 90
Yeah.
years ago?
It was in the 30s, right?
Yeah, it's actually be older than I am.
If I could, if I could speak to Frank's Tract for just a minute. Frank's Tract failed a long time ago. I believe it was in the 30s. And the reason that there's so much interest in fixing it now is that it's problematic for a myriad of reasons. There's a lot of predation there. So, you have like bass that, that live on the island, and, they're eating the salmonids as they try to make their way to the out to the ocean. It also acts as they call it a saline pump. So when the tides flow in, salt water kind of gets trapped there. So it affects salinity in the delta. So it's kind of it has a lot of negative consequences for the delta for a number of reasons. And that's why there's interest in restoring the island to something that is, is more beneficial, that provides better recreation and doesn't have that doesn't have the negative effect on the salinity and what have you. So that's why I brought it up.
Another place where the levee broke is Big Break, where we met in Oakley. And that was an asparagus farm, and I just looked it up. It flooded in 1928.
So when did they actually start building levees on the Delta? If that one was already levied?
Yeah, 1892 would be a good date to talk about, when the clamshell dredger showed up in the Delta for the first time. And almost all the levees were constructed between then and about 1920. There have been a couple of small islands that have been reclaimed since that time, Little Mandeville and I don't know, maybe another small one, but all the major levees were built by around 1920.
And I found it a little confusing that there are some levees that are non-federal that are overseen and administered by the state, and the project levees, which are the federal ones. And you had mentioned there's about 380 miles of the federal, or 300. And why the distinction? Why are there federal and state? Why aren't they under the same umbrella, under the same policy?
Well, the Corps of Engineers has their way. And one of their ways is that they study the project and determine if there's economic feasibility to be involved, and then they look for a non-federal sponsor to, like I said, do the operation maintenance and so forth. They've looked and looked, but they have not found any additional areas that are economically feasible to go into and bring up to a federal standard.
And again, that goes back to economically feasible, meaning that they're sustainable financially, or?
That the benefits for the work wouldn't exceed the cost of the work. And that includes all of the agricultural annualized benefits and so forth.
And they put a number financially based on the value of that tract to the environment or economics?
Well, they never used to give any value to the environment, but they kind of are changing it. It's like moving a battleship, you know, it takes a while to get them turned. But yes, they have economists that say this land could grow these kinds of crops, and the annual benefit, revenue that can be obtained from that is worth so much. And they do an annualized basis. They compare it with what the cost would be annualized. And if the benefits don't exceed the cost, then the federal government doesn't get involved.
If I could add on to that, one of the challenges we've had with engaging the Army Corps of Engineers in the Delta is their mission statement. So the Army does not consider water supply. It's not part of their mission statement. So when they consider the cost-benefit analysis of a levy, they do not look at its participation in the water supply for California. So the levy's function as a water supply feature does not factor in to its function. So that's been one of the challenges we've had with engaging the Corps in finding a positive BC ratio in the Delta.
Because they're primarily concerned with navigable water bodies.
Navigation and, flood, the damageable property and economic generation, yeah. So that's one of the issues we've had with the Corps. One of the other things, and I don't know if Tom can speak to this, because I actually don't know the answer, or maybe, I don't know if Wendy knows either, but there's actually urban levies in the Stockton area that are not project levies, and I don't know why. There's efforts in the works to have them be adopted by the Corps, but there are places where things have just kind of fallen through the cracks, and I'm not clear. I don't have a good backstory about why they are not part of the project system.
Not having a proper definition or an understanding on that subject, is that an impediment to maintaining the levees?
I don't understand your question.
In other words, where you're creating kind of some areas where there is not a complete, like, the Army Corps basically sets the standard, and we follow that. So if they say there are 380 miles that they are under their purview, that's what it is. If there is a chance that there are other levees that would fall under their purview, but they haven't made that determination.
Let me answer that for you. The Corps requires a sponsor to sign up for a project before they build it. So it's not a matter of looking at it and making a determination.
Give me an
is this
example of what
federal
a
or not.
sponsor would be, just to understand the concept of a sponsor. What would a sponsor be
I
like in a
mentioned,
practical
the,
sense?
Central Valley Flood Protection Board sponsors the core projects for the state. We're the state representative in doing that, and sign an agreement that says we'll operate, maintain this, and provide lands, easements, and rights of way necessary to construct. So that's very set. That's not a matter of doing an analysis. That's rigid. It's in the books. There's a signed document that
It's a
says-
contract.
Yes, a contract, exactly. There's a contract. The 2/3 of the islands in the Delta aren't project levies. There's no signed document. They developed, for economic reasons, and they've gone forward. But anyway, I hope that.
So it would require putting them under contract with the Army Corps to some extent. So they would need a sponsor that says, I'm willing to.
Right, if we wanted more project levies down there, we'd have to get the Corps to do an economic analysis that they would find that it's economic for using federal criteria to construct the levee, and the non-federal sponsors, say it's the flood board, signs off and says yes, and we'll guarantee its operation, maintenance, and so forth. That's what it would take.
And coming from like the small landowner, to become a reclamation district has a lot of hoops you have to jump through.
And costs.
And costs, and it's like an insurance policy, basically. It's saying someday this might happen, and so I'm going to have to spend all this money, I'm gonna have to fill out all this paperwork, and as Tom said, it says up to 75%, but you're lucky if it's 50%. And there's all the hoops you have to jump through to get that, to go through that whole thing. And so for the small landowner or the small reclamation district, that's really challenging. Am I being
The
accurate?
reclamation districts are all established now. The thing that always amazes me is that the federal government has been reluctant to come in and participate in any of the levee maintenance and building programs in the Delta other than the project levees. But when islands flood, if you took the amount of money that the Corps of Engineers has spent and FEMA has spent in reclaiming islands that have flooded because of inadequate construction and maintenance, it would overwhelm the amount of money that the state has spent on the subventions and special projects programs, which have basically prevented flooding of these islands. We spend somewhere around $10 to $15 million a year of the state's money in the subventions program in a good year. When one of these islands floods, I mean, back in 1982, when McDonald Island flooded, I know it took about $25 million to reclaim just that one island. As somebody said here earlier, I think maybe it was Aaron, if you wanted to try to reclaim Frank's Tract today, it would be a couple of billion or something.
It's like $3 billion. Yeah.
So it's penny wise and pound foolish is what's really going on. Because we can maintain these levees and prevent almost all of the failures at a reasonable cost. But when one floods, then you're saying, well, is it worth it to reclaim it? Now, we don't have a lot of choice on a lot of those things because the levees don't just protect the farmland now. They protect the deep water channels. They protect the transfer of water across the Delta to the CBP and the State Water Project. They protect the environmental values of the Delta. They protect an enormous recreational economy and so forth. So it's not just it's kind of, and the state doesn't do this anymore, but they used to. It's kind of difficult to just rely on the people within the island to maintain these levees that provide so many public benefits to the other factors in the state. And that's the reason why the state is sharing in the maintenance and costs.
And maybe you can make reference to if there's like an ongoing inspections program where they're assessing the strength and the condition of the levees.
Well, yeah, let me point to one other thing. The Corps of Engineers will not get involved in operation and maintenance of a project, period. Because that's their golden rule. We don't do operation and maintenance, so that's off the table. They're never going to do that for sure. Now, what was your other question?
In terms of assessing the condition of the levees.
Well, yes, the subvention program for the federal levies, they're inspected annually. And the written report is made and the Corps notifies the flood board that these are the deficiencies in this levee and they need to be taken care of. And then we work with the reclamation districts to try to meet those standards, okay? For the non-federal levies, the subvention program also has things like I think, is it every 5 years they have to provide a levy profile and information about the state of the levy. But they don't receive the inspections and things like the project levies.
Well, I think this conversation is a perfect example of why we need a whole day dedicated to this. I think Amanda's going to talk to us about the DPIC meeting. I want to keep us on track with our agenda items. So I guess one thing I'd like to just say in conclusion is that, you know, we really look forward to talking to you guys some more at the DPIC meeting. I think that this conversation about levies is kind of the perfect example of how we have these competing co-equal goals. And, you know, we were out at Frank's Tract yesterday, and we heard kind of the USGS side of why it's important to keep Frank's Tract the way that it is. And because of the salt mixing that happens there, while also trying to figure out how do you reduce predation, like you brought up, Aaron, there's problems with it, but also there could be problems in fixing it. So, you know, I just think it's a fascinating conversation. And I guess the other thing I'd like to mention is I feel like I'd be remiss if I didn't say that in light of our tribal and EJ issue paper, you know, that we had Native Americans living on, you know, what the U.S. government decided to call swampland and sell off, and they weren't allowed, you know, to participate in that process. And at that time, you know, we went and saw yesterday some of the areas that were undergoing restoration and kind of trying to picture how it all would have looked, you know, back then. And we've just engineered it so much that, you know, now we have to deal with the consequence of that. It's where we are at today. But just having an understanding of the historical knowledge and acknowledging, you know, what's happened in the past, I think is an important step as well. So we really thank you guys for coming and look forward to talking to you more on Monday. And then Amanda, do you want to come up or yeah, okay. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you to the panel. Again, Amanda Gold, Special Assistant for Planning and Science City Council, and as you can tell from this conversation, yeah, there's definite need for us to be spending a lot of time thinking and talking about levies. So we will be focusing the entirety of Monday's DPIC meeting on levies. We will be at Bobo Winery, and really the main reason we're there is because it is at the base of the levee and Elkhorn Slough. And so we'll be starting the day with a panel very similar to the one you just heard, with most of the same panelists, really just trying to kind of get a baseline understanding of levees in the Delta. And then we're just really going to kind of try and build on that throughout the day. We're going to walk up to the top of the levee and hear about really kind of what's going on along Elkhorn Slough and the work that local reclamation districts and the Conservancy have been doing, and the Conservancy is funded up there. And then in the afternoon, Jessica's actually going to moderate a panel that really is going to try and dive even deeper and focus on a myriad of issues that are at play around the levees. And so we've invited to that panel 8 experts in the field to come and provide lightning talks on issues from maintenance, funding, vegetation standards, urban levees, and we're going to have a moderated conversation just about kind of what it means trying to do all these things and to take all these things into consideration as we manage the levee system in the Delta. So the forecast is beautiful on Monday, like 70 degrees and sunny. So if you are around, would love to have you join us. We'll be starting about 10 o'clock and ending around 2:30. And yeah, it'll be a really great opportunity to dive a little bit deeper and to learn more about the levee system in the Delta. We will not be webcasting it because we're going to be outside. We're going to take advantage of the beautiful location and be outside, but we will have a recording up following the meeting. So, thank you.
Thanks, Amanda. All right, and members, do you have any more comments or questions on this item? Okay, if not, we'll go to public comment.
We have no public comment, Madam Chair.
All right. And then we'll move on to our second to last agenda item, which is our lead scientist report. So I'll turn it over to Dr. Lisa Marie Wyndham-Myers.
Great, thank you, Chair Lee. And yeah, it will be a special day. We'll start with by the numbers, and then we'll just talk a little bit about some updates and things to be on your radar. And then we'll close with highlighting a paper where we have the author also online, who will be available for comments, and so additional ability to answer questions and so on. So, let's see, let's start with by the numbers. It's going to look alarming, but no, don't fear. You can see that the reservoir levels are actually still holding about the same as they were. Oroville is a little bit lower than average now. But it is a pretty dry October so far, so we're a little bit lower than a normal October. We checked this on the data exchange quite a bit, and this is true, but it's a low, so it's low for an October, and that's sort of in keeping with this idea that we're moving into a La Nina, and so a drier south and a wetter north, where we have to just see, because the predictions for that are also getting more uncertain, so we'll see what happens in the next month. And then we look at flows on the rivers. Sacramento River is down. It was more like 20,000 CFS back in September, so it's down in Sacramento, but it's up in the San Joaquin, where it was about 1,000 cubic feet per second last month. So things are, just sort of moving around, being, they're a little bit different, but they're not wildly different than what you would expect. So as you can remember, we're still within, when it's green, it's within 90% to 100% of what the historic average is. And then the Central Valley Project and State Water Project diversion flows are a little bit lower than they were in September, last September. And then finally, when you look at the temperatures, the interesting thing about this is if you look at the left, those numbers are really, really similar to what they were in September, and it's only the historical averages that are a little bit lower, implying that, it's warmer than at Clifton Court Forebay than, it is warmer than historical average, but it's actually really similar to what September was like. So I just want to orient you that we'll see how these numbers change, but right now, yeah, it's compared to historical averages, things are looking a little warmer and drier. So we'll see what happens next month. Any questions on the numbers? Okay. All right, then let's move to some of the agenda items. Delta Science Program activities. The key ones to point out is I will mention that in the report, we have the California Sea Grant State Policy Fellowship Program highlighted here, but we're actually going to highlight it in next month's LSR. But we did have a matching program. We have 5 successful matches, so we will continue with this program just as we have been doing. We've had 44 fellows in the past, and we've been doing this well, and you approved this, the funding for this back in 2023. But I'll highlight that next month. The second thing to highlight is an informational webinar that we had on October 8th for the Delta Science Tracker, which again is how we basically keep people informed of what kind of science is happening, what's the progress, where the data and interactive updates with the producers of that data. There's a link in the agenda item if you want to go on and watch the webinar, because it teaches you how to use it and how to make the best optimal use of this product, and also how to upload your own information. So that link is in your handout. And then the third thing to highlight again is just the remarkable achievement of having the first in-person Bay Delta Science Conference in the last 6 years. We finally had it again. It was such a good turnout. It was such a wonderful event. I really applaud everybody that was involved in organizing it. I've heard nothing but good things from the attendees, and as the executive officer already highlighted, there were over 800 attendees. There was 200 organizations represented, there's 100 posters, there's 243 presentations. All of these things have abstracts. If you go to the website, you can follow these things. We do not have it recorded, so it's a real treat to have Don Hankins on the phone to talk about his paper, because he was one of the plenary speakers talking about ecocultural stewardship. And the opening remarks by Julia Lee, by Assemblymember Lori Wilson, and by State Water Resources Control Board Chair Joaquin Esquivel were always that we launched this, and then the plenaries were Diana Almendariz, who actually was a fire chief for Humboldt and knows a lot about some of the topics that we'll cover in this paper, the highlighted paper today. And then we also had Karen Morrison from the California Department of Pesticide Regulation. And those topics, and then the one by Don Hankins, were really a great way to start the whole conference because it was a very broad assortment of issues to be dealt with within the Bay Delta. I also want to highlight the town hall that was organized by Tricia Lee, and then the executive Jessica Pearson and I were the co-hosts. We were the Alex Trebeks of the event, and it was just a wonderful way to talk about the changes that are expected in the Delta plan. In the Delta Science Plan that's coming forward, and so try to orient everybody to what's going on with that advance of the next Delta Science Plan, which we're working on right now to come out in 2025. All right. And again, the link is in here for all of these abstracts. It's good. And then on that note, I want to point out things to be on your radar. So you heard about DPIC on Monday. Another DPIC opportunity coming up is the Restoration Subcommittee. We'll be meeting November 13th. The focus is going to be on South Delta restoration opportunities, and particularly multi-benefit opportunities in Stockton. So if you're interested, and the public is invited as well to attend the workshop. That's one thing coming up. Another thing coming up is the Delta Science Tracker, as I highlighted already. They're actually going to have an office hours series about mid-morning, October 31st, November 6th, November 21st, and December 5th to provide assistance to people who are trying to use or upload their information into the Delta Science Tracker. So again, the link is in here on how to get started with Delta Science Tracker, but again, this is how we are hoping to bring the community together to make sure everybody knows who's working on what and how to find their data. So that's all I have for the updates from the Delta Science Program, except for the highlighted publications. So any questions before we move forward? Okay. All right, so this is a treat, this particular paper, because there was a special issue of the Proceedings of the National Academies of Science that focused on addressing sustainable opportunities in the changing climate of California. And this was a series of perspective papers, and one of the papers was by Dr. Don Hankins, who's on the phone, or on the line right now. And the idea was to focus on living with impacts of climate change. And so the paper that he wrote, Climate Resilience Through Ecocultural Stewardship, really highlights this issue of indigenous stewardship. And this is a way of knowing that can provide knowledge of how to live with and through climate change in this place, which you'll see in the paper often refers to this place as country, which is the land, the water, the plants, all of it. And so the focus of the paper is really to highlight this unique diversity that we have here, and the burden that that indigenous peoples globally have upon them to steward biodiversity. 6% of the globe is indigenous peoples, 80% of the biodiversity is on their lands, and 24% of the land is actually occupied. So in terms of distribution, there's a lot of influence in indigenous communities globally. And California is especially unique in terms of having very high biodiversity and very high indigenous cultural diversity. So even though there's diversity amongst the indigenous peoples, there's also this sort of underlying intergenerational and more larger perspective assessment of resource management. So The purpose of the paper is to talk about the history of what we know and also how to move forward in terms of actions. He focuses primarily in the paper on fire because it's such a good example of how things have changed. And there's even a term, one of the papers he highlighted was called fire pyrodiversity. So just how pyrodiversity actually helps with biodiversity. Some things to highlight in the paper in terms of fire are the fact that when we move away from culturally determined burnings, where you have lower targeted burnings that are focusing on specific resources and specific targets, and wanting to make, for example, a mosaic of ages of stands of vegetation, whether it's oak woodlands or whether it's riparian forests or whether it's wetlands, but just to have a mosaic of things that sometimes would be used, for example, for different twigs that would be used in basket weaving or so on. If you think about things that way, that breadth, it gives you a lot more resilience, not just for species and biodiversity, but also for water resources, carbon sequestration, things that we care about on the landscape, and also reducing fire risk. So the graphic here is just to illustrate how smaller targeted burnings allows a more diverse and a healthier landscape. Then I think you all know what we're living with is very large mega fire risks. And basically, catastrophic changes, and all of these leading to reduced ability for infiltration of water in the landscape, increased toxins in the watershed, and mudslides, and just lots of instability. So therefore, fire is just one of these key factors that if it's thought about in an ecocultural perspective, you'll have a better outcome in terms of using it as a tool to reduce our risk in the long run. So I could highlight many more things on here, but I think I'm going to open it up to Dr. Hankins if he's online and wants to highlight whatever he thinks I've overstepped in the paper.
Yeah, good morning, everyone, and thanks for having a consideration of this work today. I really appreciate that this committee is actually looking at this work, because while I did highlight fire in the paper, the Delta is definitely part of something that's near and dear to my heart. It is my ancestral homeland as a Miwok person, and some of the examples I do provide in there do talk about some of the restoration work that's at least being framed out in the Delta, particularly thinking about work around metropolitan water districts, islands in the Delta. One thing I think I would highlight here is, in actually thinking about it in relationship to the prior topic on levees, is the concept of a lelte, which I introduced in the paper, which uses it's a term that's in our language that describes the relationship between how we look at the landscape. And the word actually means to read. In our language, it's not a written language, it's an oral language. So one might think, well, how the heck do you have a word for reading in a language that's oral? But really, that idea of reading is a concept of not only using our five senses, but also the sixth sense of what I'll call spirit as a way, or intuition as a way of understanding, seeing where problems are and being able to address them. In the context of the Delta itself, and trying to bring this paper into the relevancy of the Delta, that idea of Velote is something that made the Delta something as a landscape that's evolved over the last climate events that have occurred for thousands and thousands of years. And we have lived in that landscape with those changes taking place and have adapted to it through our stewardship practices and so forth. And so as I think about those opportunities, those same principles that have helped to make the Delta as what it is today are the same principles that can be applied to what would make it to be what it is in the future. And so thinking about the challenges of sea level rise in particular, when we start to think of how we can apply those knowledges of restoration, which plants, how those plants are stewarded, how they grow, what that stewardship practice, which also includes fire, is brought into it. It's definitely something that is relevant to addressing the problems that we face today. There's another element that I would also kind of highlight in context of the Delta is that when we think about the context of indigenous stewardship, it's often framed in the understanding of traditional story or law, which is rooted in natural law. And so, I don't highlight this in the paper, but I definitely brought it up in the plenary discussion at the Delta Science Conference, and that is the alignment of our traditional story places, storyscapes that outline where origin of water is, which is impacted currently by state, federal, local water projects in the South Delta. The functionality of that system, bringing it back into alignment with traditional law is a really important aspect of how we can greater create a system of resilience of drought cycles and those sorts of things, and understanding the dynamics of species within place as well. Those are all critical understandings that are brought forward in that indigenous knowledge system that I'll just point out hasn't really been recognized within the way the Delta's been stewarded for the past 100 plus years. But it's something that I think we need to find ways of bringing back into the way that we steward, particularly if we're going to have any chance of being resistant to the effects of climate change going forward. So I'll stop there for a moment just to see if there's any questions or comments or anything there.
Nope, please continue.
Yeah, so I think that's a really nice opportunity for us to think about where and how this sort of knowledge can come into existence. One of those things I think that we often hear about, and I bring this up in the paper, is the idea of indigenous-led, stewardship opportunities in terms of integration into planning and outright indigenous stewardship in place. A lot of times what people, kind of the concept du jour is to, do this idea of land back or water back, which I point out is potentially problematic, particularly in a place like the Delta, depending on where it's at, who we're consulting with in terms of what the governance structures are. There's a layering of complexity there that I think needs to be understood when we get into those spaces. But I definitely see that there's an opportunity for indigenous peoples, particularly cultural practitioners, to engage in leading these efforts and identifying the places that are of critical importance, and then how to go about planning and implementing work within those places. And so there's a lot of layers to the ways that we understand that are brought forward in the paper that include, the planning elements, and the broader opportunities for stewardship that could potentially come from that engagement. While the paper is definitely conceptual in the sense of what it provides, I think that there's a lot more detail that can be brought forward in conversations with organizations like you all, and the partnerships that we have within our communities to be able to engage that and build it out further. So I really hope that in the context of sharing this, that it is something that is thought-provoking and also offers a sense of hope for the challenges that we face. I don't necessarily see them as insurmountable. I think that we can definitely rise to the challenge, but we definitely have to start to act quickly to address these things. And so I'm always enthusiastic about the work that I see happening, the new conversations that are coming forward, the new partnerships that are coming forward to try to address these things. And so stop there to see, again, if there's questions, comments, or anything to that effect.
Thank you so much, Dan. I do have a question. As we're moving into Native American Heritage Month, I'm curious if there's any collaborations or partnerships you think we can highlight that would be particularly relevant to the council and some of the advances that we're hoping to make here in the Delta and in the larger watershed.
Yeah, not a specific thing I would say. I would, there's definitely a lot of entities that are starting to take a greater interest in the Delta. I was at a conference, 2 weeks ago, hosted by Shingle Springs, that was called the Sierra Tribal Summit. Shingle Springs was just the host tribe for that event, but it was intertribal. And there was a panel that was focused on, tribal beneficial use of water as an example, and the challenges that are there within the Environmental Protection Agency to establish tribal beneficial use of water, specifically looking at mercury, and the food web. There, I think they were looking at 4 meals per day as a kind of or 4 meals per week. And I would say that if we put it in the context of true ecocultural stewardship and a traditional diet system, 4 meals a week wouldn't cut it. It's every meal of every day would ultimately be rooted in a traditional diet to the landscape. And so, when we think about the connections, it's not just about mercury, it's about the broader context of the food web itself and the health of the landscape and the waterways, which is about water quality, and so much more. There are efforts by tribal communities adjacent to the Delta to look at restoration. One example of that that's been involved in the land back movement is the Segorte Land Trust. I'm not personally involved with the work that they do, but I do work closely with some of those folks in terms of the work that we do, and including planning for some of the ecocultural restoration at Web Tract and on Bolden. And we're trying to figure out ways of advancing some of that work, not within, say, Segorte Land Trust, but with the broader, indigenous community. So those are some things that I would maybe highlight. And obviously, just the general access issues and stewardship issues are things that we've been kind of working through for a while now.
Does anyone else have any questions? No. Well, I just want to thank you for being here today. I loved your plenary talk at the Bay Delta Science Conference that we had at the end of September, beginning of October. It was really well received, and I think it's really timely with our tribal and EJ issue paper that we're have out for public comment right now. We really appreciate you interacting with us and bringing this information to us. So, Lisa Marie, do you have any other items on your agenda?
I do not. Thank you so much.
Okay. All right. Do we have any public comment on this item?
No, Madam Chair, we do not.
All right. Our final agenda item is the preparation for the next council meeting, which will take place November 21st, again here at the CNRA building in Sacramento. So please refer to the posted meeting notice for further information or updates. And with that, we're adjourned.
Great job as always, Julie. Thank you. Well done.